Hello, everyone. Welcome back to a new It's a Progressive World interview. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Sam, but today we have the pleasure of being joined again by Professor Gerald Horne. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. I'll just give a quick introduction and then we can get right into it. You, of course, don't really need any introduction in these circles, but here's a very brief one. You hold the Morse Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. You are the author of over 300 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews. And your most recent books include The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of U.S. Fascism, and also your latest book, which I believe came out past week, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1918 to 1968. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. And by the way, I've been busy, but I haven't written 300 books.
Oh, no? Over
No.
300 books and 100 scholarly articles.
No, not 300.
Yeah.
No. As a matter of fact.
Oh my God, I can't believe I said 300. I don't know why I wrote 300. I meant 30 books.
Oh, I see.
Oh, 30.
Sorry about that. I was going to say I got it from the University of Houston's page, but it did say 30. I just added a zero there. So my apologies. So I thought before we get into your most recent books, just wanted to kind of ask you about your general views on the United States, anything in particular in recent times that have caught your attention. Of course, there's the whole Trump stuff going on today, but yes, anything really.
Well, I just gave a lecture that you can find online. It was just a few days ago, March 31st, 2023, on the rise of neo-fascism, not least in the United States of America. And I think that that's something that should concern us all, not least because it's been accompanied by similar trends in Italy with the election of the neo-fascist Prime Minister Meloni, with what might be the impending ascension to power in Vienna of the Freedom Party, the continued strength of the ultra-rightist Alternative for Germany party. I mean, I could go on in this vein. And so there's a very discernible trend. And what helps to complicate our ability to fight back against this trend is that many of our histories that should guide us with regard to the present and the future are seriously askew. That is to say, many of our histories and our historians, they don't even grapple with the question of indigenous dispossession. I mean, it's like indigenous people don't exist, even though that's obviously fraudulent and racist, if not worse. And so, because they don't have an accurate analysis of the past, an accurate analysis that would discuss settler colonialism, this process that, as you know, not only helps to describe what's befallen the indigenous of Australia, the indigenous of New Zealand and Canada, historic Palestine, what once befell the indigenous of Southern Africa, but somehow that descriptor is not necessarily used in our classrooms. And we also know that one of the reasons is that when you do try to tell an accurate story about the bloody, often genocidal past of this country, you run into a roadblock in the form of what's happening in Florida right now with Governor DeSantis, with regard to seeking to circumscribe the teaching of African American studies, or with regard to the 45th US president, who may become the 47th US president, speaking of Mr. Trump, who, in the wake of the initiation of the 1619 project of Howard University's Nicole Hannah-Jones, he inaugurated a 1776 commission that repeated the dreary misreadings and lies, quite frankly, that have often characterized the story of how this country was built. And so, because we oftentimes are denied an accurate rendering of how we got to this point, it leaves many befuddled and baffled as to why we are discussing neo-fascism. And it's not just me. Recall that the 46th US president raised the same point a few months ago. And the late Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, one of her last books was Fascism, a Warning. And so I'm sure that many who endured a typical US education are now scratching their heads and stroking their chins, trying to figure out, well, if this is such a great country that built this vaunted constitution and a sturdy democratic republic, why is it that we may be on the verge of fascism? So that is what concerns me as we speak.
A quick question, actually, before getting to your latest books. When you talk about fascism or no fascism, how do you define, like, do you see it as an authoritarian state that has like a one-party system? Is it defined by ethnocentrism, racism? How do you see that?
It's like capitalism from which fascism grows. The capitalism that exists in the United States of America is not exactly the same as the capitalism that exists in Scandinavia. It's not even necessarily the same as the capitalism that exists in Canada, where you have a single payer healthcare system. As a matter of fact, Canada, in many ways, is closer to the social democratic capitalist regimes of Northern Europe than it is to its closest neighbor. I think that there is the traditional interpretation of fascism. And by the way, as I said, I discussed this in the lecture that you can easily find online that I gave a few days ago at the University of Houston. And I begin by recalling the traditional interpretation of the Bulgarian patriot Georgy Dimitrov, who faced off against the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s, who described fascism as the reactionary rule, the terroristic rule of the most reactionary sector of the capitalist class. Now, in the United States, in the current issue of the journal, The New Republic, there is an article by the Seattle intellectual Daniel Bessner, who's reviewing a book by Bruce Kulick, Kulick, on the arrival of fascism as a concept on these shores. And like many, Mr. Bessner feels that the traditional interpretation, the traditional definition of fascism is in a posit, that it does not capture what is unfolding in the United States of America. Fair enough. Come up with a definition that describes what will happen if this country turns in that ominous direction. I think you'll see an acceleration of certain trends, acceleration of police terror, acceleration of occupants of death row, more electoral shenanigans, political assassinations along the lines of what befell Japan and Germany in the 1930s. And as I also say in this lecture that I'm pointing your audience to, what's happened in the United States is that for the longest time, you had different systems existing on these shores. You know, China talks about one country, two systems. Well, the United States beat them to the punch, although fortunately it's not the kind of system that I'm about to describe in the United States. For example, there was dispossession of the indigenous, genocide against the indigenous, enslavement of the Africans, and a kind of bourgeois democracy for the settlers. And after formidable struggle and shedding of blood, and also assistance from the international community, we were able to move away, we thought, from that system. And we thought what we were moving towards was bourgeois democracy across the board. But in light of book bannings, in light of the death penalty, in light of the crisis of masculinity as captured and encapsulated by the attacks on women's reproductive freedom, what we might be enduring in this country, instead of having those formerly subjected to genocide and enslavement being integrated into bourgeois democracy, you might have the opposite. That is to say, the whole country moving towards what once only befell those of us who did not happen to be settlers. And even if you look at the rise of US apartheid post 1865, post the end of the US Civil War, one of the things you'll notice is that settlers who were unsympathetic to genocide against the indigenous or apartheid inflicted on what used to be called the Negroes, they could be lynched too. They could be liquidated too. They could be run out of town. And so they were being subjected to the kinds of pulverizing and penalties that we thought was the province of those of us who were not settlers. And so this is a very ominous turn of events, I assure you. If the United States decides, in its collective lack of wisdom, to, instead of moving to integrate many of us into bourgeois democracy, it moves in the opposite direction.
And do you think until recently it was perhaps moving into that direction and there's been a kind of switch back, or this is how trends have been going on for the past few hundred years?
Well, I would say that the key to understanding what's happened in the United States is you have to understand what's going on in the world. For example, you cannot begin to understand why slavery collapsed when it did without understanding the Haitian Revolution, without understanding the victory of the unpaid sector of the working class, which comes to power circa 1804, begins to broker diplomatic alliances, begins to lobby internationally, begins to sponsor revolts of the enslaved throughout the Americas, and that creates a crisis that leads to the United States. You can't begin, at least the United States abolishing slavery. You can't begin to understand the United States agonizing and halting retreat away from the more egregious aspects of U.S. apartheid, Jim Crow, without understanding the growth of socialism, without understanding the rise of national liberation movements, not least in Africa and the Caribbean, but also in South Asia and elsewhere, Latin America, Caribbean, etc. And the United States, in a battle of ideas with the socialist camp for hearts and minds amongst these newly independent nations, awash in natural resources, Washington found that the better part of wisdom was to move away from the horrors of U.S. apartheid. Because oftentimes when African diplomats and South Asian diplomats came to Washington, D.C., they were not allowed to visit restaurants and hotels, for example. In fact, one State Department employee suggested that these diplomats be given a lapel button so they could be distinguished from Black Americans and could therefore be treated like the settlers. But that didn't fly, particularly when Black Americans, with their usual ingenuity, began to fake accents, began to wear African gowns, etc., so that they could then integrate these hotels and restaurants. Sorry?
Higher society, integrate into higher society.
Well, yes, or to society in general. And so what's happened, as you know, in the last few decades, you've had Copernican changes in the international community with the rise of neoliberalism, the erosion of the socialist camp. But now, what we need to think about quite deeply is what President Xi Jinping announced in his visit to Moscow just a few days ago, where as he was departing, he said to President Putin that changes are afoot in the world that we haven't seen in a century. If that's the case, once again, we have to ask, what will be the impact on the domestic situation in the United States of America? The problem is that many of our intellectuals, many of our organizations, they're not thinking globally. Many of them, they couldn't point to Ukraine or Afghanistan on a map. They couldn't point to Ukraine even if you spotted them Poland. They couldn't point to Afghanistan even if you spotted them Pakistan, for example. So this is the problem we have in this country. And this is a direct outgrowth of how and why the United States proceeded in recent decades, where it tended to marginalize the most internationally minded amongst us. I think of the late, great Paul Robeson in the first instance, a man who spoke dozens of languages, had allies all around the world, but it was also pro-socialist, and so he had to walk the plank, metaphorically. And so it's left many of us bereft, because as used to be said in the bad old days of slavery, you have to only beat one slave to keep the entire plantation in line. And in other words, you have a model demonstration. You beat down the most vigorous amongst us, and the rest of us get the message. And so that's what's happened over the past few decades.
So although the US is really a superpower, you kind of one way that you look at development in the United States is see how things are changing globally, and I guess how that leads the US to react to it.
In part.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you have to look at the domestic situation as well. You have to look at both. I mean, for example, on the domestic front, the United States obviously has not been able to recover, or I would say the progressive movement in this country has yet to recover from the bludgeoning of progressive trade unions during the preceding epoch, speaking of the Red Scare and the Cold War. We just had an election in the United Auto Workers, headquartered in Michigan. At one time, this was a union that was thought to be in the vanguard of workers' rights. You cannot begin to understand the anti-Jim Crow movement without understanding the subsidies supplied by the United Auto Workers to that movement. In fact, look at the history of the late George Crockett, for example, who was a Black congressman from Detroit, used to be a lawyer for the United Auto Workers, was also elected to Congress, serving decades or years, I should say, in Congress. When he was purged from the United Auto Workers during the Red Scare period, it was a signal. Just like in 1949, Mr. Crockett, then a young lawyer, was an attorney in the prosecution of the Communist Party leadership. His defense was so vigorous that after the trial, they not only jailed the defendants, they jailed him. The lawyer was jailed. And obviously that sends a signal when you jail lawyers. And so I have been informed, at least, that the United Auto Workers just had a recent election and that progressive leadership is coming to the fore. We shall see, because I've heard that message before. So pardon me if I'm not uncorking the champagne bottles. We also know that in the state of Michigan, which historically had been a bellwether of labor radicalism and progressivism, you just had the changing of laws that will make it easier to organize trade unions in that bellwether state. But we also know that in Washington, D.C., it has been next to impossible to change federal laws to make it easier to organize trade unions. So it's a mixed bag in the United States right now. It would be premature, to put it mildly, to suggest that neo-fascism is around the corner, that it will descend next month. But at the same time, it would be premature to suggest that we've turned the corner and that neo-fascism is on the run. Not if we can talk credibly about the 45th US president becoming the 47th US president.
And I should mention, in fact, we're supposed to have at the end of this month Daniel Besner on our channel. And so, I mean, you think his criticism that fascism is very much based on my understanding of it through a podcast, which is that fascism is very much limited or is a concept that comes from Nazi Germany and therefore doesn't really apply to other situations. You don't quite agree with that?
Hey, no. I used to be a lawyer, so I would say demure. I demure.
Very diplomatic.
No, yeah, I would say fair enough. But then the burden shifts. And what is the term that we're going to use then? If you don't like that term, what term should we use? What term should we use to describe what I just depicted, where you had one country with two systems? I mean, you had one country where you had bourgeois democracy for the settlers, and you had enslavement for the Africans. Okay, if you don't like that term, and its descendants, come up with another term. But please don't try to act as some of our scholars do, and I'm not sure if this is true of your colleague, that all of this talk about the rise of neo-fascism is ridiculous because we have this sturdy constitution. I mean, I happened to be in Chile in the summer of 1973. And I recall having talks with Chileans who assured me, progressive Chileans, that any talk of a military coup was ridiculous. Mm. I left Chile, came back to the United States a few weeks later, September 11, 1973. You had Augusto Pinochet overthrow Salvador Allende's government. We are told that Salvador Allende, the socialist leader, committed suicide. We have seen pictures of him with a machine gun and a helmet, machine gun gifted by President Fidel Castro of Cuba. By the way, Fidel spent weeks in Chile right before the coup. Obviously, he's trying to talk to the comrades and tell them to try to get their act together. But so I don't know how long, well, I've lived in this country all my life. And one of the things I've grown sadly accustomed to is intellectuals coming from the settler class, oftentimes downplaying or not understanding the country in which they reside, perhaps because they don't have any sort of granular understanding of white supremacy, a term that they rarely use. They don't have a granular understanding of settler colonialism, a term that they rarely use. They rarely talk about dispossession of the indigenous. I mean, you can go to Northern California, where you had some of the bloodiest wars against the indigenous in North American history. Many of these people from the settler class, they don't even know that. And these are progressive people. So I'm not going to cast aspersions on any of your future guests.
No.
But as of now, color me skeptical with regard to those who disparage the concept of fascism, but don't come up with a substitute.
No, I see what you're saying. I mean, for me, when I heard him say that, one thing that resonated, but this you can say it about every single term, so it doesn't apply to this. I mean, that would be unfair, which is that fascism, just when it's used colloquially nowadays, it's just thrown around so left and right towards like individual people that it's really kind of undermining the meaning of the word. But now, I mean, of course, we're talking in a much more serious and academic sense, of course.
Well, that may be true, but that's the sort of discussion that we may have time to discuss at length in the concentration camps.
Hopefully not.
But sir, going back to your book sheds lights on a very specific period, and I think somewhat sort of understudied period. I had no idea about a lot of these, like the Modoc War, and you go into a lot of details about the Republic of Texas. I just thought maybe you can share some of the highlights, and like maybe the Modoc genocide was fascinating to me. Like I had no idea about that before your book.
So sorry, now we're talking about the counter-revolution of 1836.
Well, fundamentally, the United States is one massive crime scene. You know how the crime scene, the police come, they put yellow tape around the scene to preserve the evidence. You used to have yellow tape stretching from Maine to Seattle, from Seattle to San Diego, and San Diego down to Key West, Florida. To sum it up, what happens is that in the late 1820s, a president in Mexico of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero, moves to abolish slavery. And it was feared in the Mexican province of Tejas, or Texas, where a number of so-called Anglo-American settlers had descended of late with their property in tow, that this decision would spread to their land, jeopardizing their fortunes. And so they did what they proceeded to do in 1861. They sought to leave Mexico, which led to a bloody war between Mexico and Texas. With the assistance of the United States government, the settlers prevailed, set up an independent country, the Republic of Texas, which became not only a leader in terms of dispossessing the indigenous, but also a leader in the African slave trade. The Lone Star flag of this so-called republic could be found off the coast of Angola, could be found off the coast of Brazil and Cuba, the two leading markets, not to mention the United States itself, despite the fact the United States supposedly had abolished the slave trade in 1807, 1808, which many scholars accept blithely. I mean, it's like saying that marijuana is illegal in Texas, so people don't smoke marijuana. I mean, it's ludicrous. So in any case, what happens is that Texas cannot stand up to the abolitionist movement, spearheaded by Haiti, spearheaded by activists, not least in London. So it crawls into the United States of America as a state, the 28th state, in 1845, and then spurs the United States to wage a war against Mexico, 1846 to 1848, from which the United States emerges triumphant with California, amongst other properties. California now being the most populous and richest U.S. state, supposedly the fifth largest economy on planet Earth, if looked at on its own terms. However, the United States and Texas in particular still had a bone to pick with Mexico because enslaved from Texas could walk across the border. People complaining about walking across the border today. Well, in the 19th century, walking across the border was a different story, with thousands of Africans walking across the border into Mexico, leading to inflamed relations between the enslavers and Mexico, and also massive capital loss. What's interesting about these U.S. left-wing intellectuals, bless their hearts, bless their souls, supposedly, they're into class, not into race. Race is a social construct. What about class? Race is identity politics. Okay, the unpaid sector of the working class, that's a class question. And you should be able to explain why it is that the descendants of the unpaid sector of the working class tend to vote more heavily against the right wing in 2023 than any other demographic. It's a product of the bitter class struggles that the unpaid sector of the working class engaged in, and then helped to pass that on to the descendants. Likewise, with regard to what used to be called the Negro question, many of these left-wing intellectuals, they don't even realize the import of the fact that one of the largest uncompensated expropriations of private property in world history took place on these shores when the investment in the bodies of enslaved Africans was liquidated without compensation to the enslavers, helping to create terror and fury that still besets us, helping to create an anti-Washington psychosis, which still afflicts the right wing, 75 million strong, if you look at the November 2020 vote, disproportionately and heavily comprised of the descendants of settlers, and also helping to fuel this maniacal, psychopathic, anti-socialist crusade, which has led to debacles known as the Cold War, which did little more than put China in the passing lane. And any intelligent person ought to be able to understand what I meant by that phrase. In any case, back to Texas. So Texas, which spearheads the war against Mexico in 1846, then it spearheads the war against the United States in 1861 to overthrow the United States government to ensure that slavery exists forevermore. They were defeated militarily, but not politically, which is one of the reasons why you had, after the fall of slavery, the imposition of apartheid, Jim Crow, and the further enhanced liquidation of the indigenous, which was unfolding during the Civil War. Recall that the sainted and vaunted Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, even after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, supposedly freeing the enslaved, was trying to send us to Brazil, to Dominican Republic. There are even stories about him trying to send us to Australia. Actually, in retrospect, I wouldn't have minded winding up in Australia if that had happened. But somehow he failed.
Too late.
So, sorry.
It's too late now.
Yeah, so we're stuck here. And so, what happens is that with the abolition of slavery, the expropriation of the property of the enslavers, their liquidation as a class, they were defeated militarily, as noted, but not politically, and then went on to dominate the United States and pass on that domination to forces who on January 6, 2021, tried to execute a coup d'etat, which was defeated, although I don't think we've heard the last of these folks.
So I just wanted to emphasize this, that you believe that was a material interest for this set. Like it wasn't just they were racist. There was capital flight. They were basically, because of the Haitian Revolution, the abolition of slavery in Mexico, there was United States sort of a slave owning class was being financially pressured. Is that correct?
Absolutely, it's correct. I mean, I know that there are those, even on the left, who prefer the fairy tale. It's just like the fairy tale about the retreat of Jim Crow in the 1950s and 1960s, where the settlers, they smacked their forehead and said, I didn't know we were treating Negroes so terribly in this country. We need to do something about that. I mean, that's what people are actually taught. As opposed to what I just described, that there was movements towards decolonization in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The United States is an ideological contestation with the socialist camp, and had to do something or see perhaps jeopardizing their material interest. But alas, many of the settlers didn't get the memo. And so you had relentless campaigning against these changes. You know, you had these riots in Little Rock in 1957 by the settlers, Oxford, Mississippi in 1962, Boston in the 1970s, Yonkers, New York in the 1980s. Just recently in the state of Florida, perhaps we can say that their governor will be the next US president, although we shall see. They just withdrew from certain classrooms. A movie about the story of 6-year-old Ruby Bridges, who's this Black girl in New Orleans, who tries to desegregate a school, and adults, settler adults, riot. These people are, they're a bit much. Although you have to understand the underlying reasons being what I've already talked about. The fact that it was no accident that the United States did not abolish slavery until there was a bloody war, although many historians would like to convince us somehow otherwise. It's not, it's certainly consequential that you had this large expropriation of private property in the bodies of enslaved Africans, which creates fury. When I tell this to my undergraduates sometimes, undergraduates, as you probably know, you're lecturing, they're fiddling with their smartphones, I guess looking at TikTok or sending texts, emails, doing everything except what they're supposed to be doing. And so I'll come and grab the phone from their hands. So I've just expropriated your private property. You feel angry now. I'm sure you're furious. You probably want to take me outside and thrash me. And then, of course, I give it back to them to illustrate this point that when you expropriate private property, or even the threat of appropriation. You know, the U.S.
And
foreign
the private
policy,
property being here, African Americans, slaves.
exactly, exactly, and
There is a
that's why,
reaction.
some of our quote friends unquote on the left, you're accused of identity politics if you want to talk about Black people, because we should be talking about the class question, not realizing that is a class question, because the class of unpaid workers was disproportionately comprised of Africans. Now, of course, not exclusively, because we know that in California, for example, they enslaved the indigenous. We know that when the settlers began to arrive here en masse in the 17th century, that not only they began to enslave the indigenous, but they began to ship them overseas, particularly to the slave markets of Turkey, to use the current term. And so inevitably, these oppressors, they tended to integrate race and class. I guess they knew that this would then flummox many people on the left who couldn't figure out that race and class were integrated, and that if you talk about Black people, it's not like you're in identity politics. You're trying to give a materialist analysis of what's going on in this country, so that we can escape the ravages of neo-fascism.
I just feel like a lot of people, not you though, like they don't talk about it like you in a very materialistic analysis. They just want to basically throw around some words, and that kind of leads to, I think, sort of misunderstandings, misapprehensions of, like, you know what I mean? Like, a lot of people, I feel like they don't understand identity, like they don't understand class as a consequence of sort of, materialistic analysis. Would you agree with that some people abuse that?
I agree, and I think part of the problem is the academy. That is to say, historians and most scholars, they're trying to be narrow specialists. To reduce it to the absurd, they'll write a book about the manufacture of black shoestrings in 16th century France. And then they'll do a book on the manufacturing of white shoestrings in 16th century France. And then they'll do a book about the manufacturing of blue shoestrings. So they're very narrowly gauged.
That's very true.
Which, of course, helps them, at least thus far, in terms of escaping the intense scrutiny of the right wing. Because if they were to take a more comprehensive, holistic view, well, then they would be attacked. I mean, and speaking of identity politics, what's interesting, in my 16th century book, I explain at some length how and why it is that we're speaking English on these shores. It has a lot to do with the religious conflicts that were coursing through Europe, and how what was probably the preeminent power, speaking in the Ottoman Turks, overdetermined the Iberian powers and the Catholic powers, speaking of Spain and Portugal, and underdetermined England, which, after all, only began to engage the Protestant sect in the 1530s. And so the Protestant sect in London, which was eager to share in the bounty that was dispossession of the indigenous and enslavement of the Africans, in which the Spanish had pioneered. But by the way, as a footnote, the Spanish also enslaved the indigenous, and of course they enslaved Africans. However, the Spanish were quite capable of having African conquistadors. Look at the history of Cuba, for example, from the inception of settlement in the early 1500s. The English moved towards whiteness, which is something they should read. These people on the left, they should read what I've written on the 16th century. They might learn something. And it was
apocalypse.
The dawning of the apocalypse. It was an improvisation. That is to say, first of all, the English, they made peace of a sort with those who they had been warring, the Scots, the Irish, for example. No accident, as I pointed out, that after the bountiful feast of colonialism comes to an end in the 20th century, you began to see a resurgence of Scottish nationalism, which probably some point in this century will lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. And then in the 16th century, they moved towards pan-Europeanism as opposed to Spanish having Catholicism. As I talk about in the history of Florida, which is really the creation site of settler colonialism on these shores, the Spanish would expel Europeans who were not Catholic, for example. Whereas London, if you look at the history of the state of Maryland in the 17th century, it's basically started by Catholics, even though London is the preeminent Protestant power. Washington, D.C., the capital of this country, used to be Catholic territory to a greater or lesser extent. And so pan-Europeanism morphs into whiteness, which then morphs into white supremacy. And that proves to be the winning ticket, which is one of the reasons, to circle back, why in the 1820s you had a president of Mexico of African descent, because he was Catholic, you see. Whereas the United States had to wait 200 years to 2008 to have a president of African descent, Barack Obama. Although I should also mention, and let me tread carefully here, that as I point out in my book, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, in a footnote, myself and others, and I include myself, we oftentimes toss around the word racism, which I will continue to do. But in some instances, we're really talking about national origin discrimination. What I mean is that it's well known, as I was hinting a moment or two ago, a Black person, if they spoke French, for example, you might be able to be served in a restaurant in Alabama. Angela Davis talks about how they would flummox. She grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, the citadel of Jim Crow. And they would go into clothing stores, her and her sister, and they speak French, and they'd be treated like they were human beings. She went in there speaking English, you might get lynched. So we're really talking about national origin discrimination, which then brings me to this point. And let me say that I'm not a Negro nationalist. I think we need all the help we can get. But we have to realize reality. We have to recognize reality. And that I think subsequent historians, and assuming that these suicidal maniacs in Washington don't blow up the world, will find it intriguing that the first Black president actually had roots in Kenya, not a descendant of mainland enslaved Africans who have been fighting these settlers toe-to-toe, my ancestors, for example. And the first Black vice president has roots in Jamaica, not in mainland enslaved Africans in Texas or Georgia or Virginia. And you know, these basic realities about the United States somehow tend to escape all these scholars who are supposedly studying and pontificating about U.S. reality. I mean, it's really a shame and a sin.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Again, I don't want to, I'm not trying to cast shade on Barack or Kamala because of their national origins, maybe, of course, about their policies. But I feel compelled to bring up this point in order to indict the settlers, not to indict their national origins, just to be clear.
No, of course. And no, that's very interesting. So, Professor, I want to ask you two things. One was if you could just also give a quick overview, if you don't mind, of your latest book, Revolting Capital. But before that, I just want to ask two more questions too, because I know we're kind of pressed on time, just to get it. So yes, you haven't written 300 books, but you've written 30 books. So I just want to ask you how you go about your day, and because you do these interviews and then you're also still teaching. Do you put aside a special time for for your research and writing? And then last question I really wanted to ask you is if you had any thoughts on that deal brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran by China.
Yeah. I have to say the latter is intriguing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it bespeaks the changing correlation of forces. Perhaps even more important is that the Saudis and the Chinese might start to trade the Saudis' precious commodity, speaking of oil, and the Chinese currency, part of this process of de-dollarization, which is quite threatening to U.S. imperial hegemony, perhaps indicative of these changes that President Xi spoke about during his trip to Moscow as he was departing. Hopefully, it will restrain the war hawks in both Israel and the United States, who would like nothing more than to attack Iran, for example. So it's very important. Now, with regard to my own process, to give you an example, I do these interviews for Pacifica Radio, KPFK in Los Angeles. And by the way, you can find those interviews online. They're all over the place. And so last year, February 2022, I was interviewing Curtis Austin, who's written about the Black Panther Party. And so he said that there was no study of the Southern California Black Panther Party. So I said, that seems like an interesting topic. So that's what I've been working on. So after this DC book comes out, my next book will be entitled Armed Struggle, ? Panthers, Communists, and Black Nationalists in Southern California through the 1960s. Because armed struggle, you could argue, and I won't dispute it, you can argue that this was premature to launch armed struggle in the belly of the beast. Yeah, I won't argue with you, but that's what people decided to do. As a matter of fact, I'm going to begin the book by talking about 1971 in the Czech embassy in Algiers, where the Black Panthers had their main foreign legation. And Panthers leaders are negotiating with the Czechs about getting machine guns. And then I'll reel back to the 1930s and talk about at the Lenin School in Moscow, people were being trained in constructing Molotov cocktails, in building street brigade barricades, in various kinds of insurrectionary activity, for example, and then going from there. And the DC book. So yes, it has a revised title, Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000.
Okay.
Now, of course, acute listeners might get the multiple meanings of revolting capital, revolting capitalists, revolting capital in terms of D.C., for reasons I explained in the book, happens to be otherwise known as Chocolate City, although gentrification is trying to transform that, which is politically important since federal juries and local juries in Washington oftentimes are disproportionately comprised of Black people, which is one of the reasons why the right wing would like to change that, because they know we're on their case. And then, of course, revolting. I mean, it's revolting. It's ugly. It's racist. It's imperialist, etc. Now, some of the themes that I explore in this book is what I was talking about a moment or two ago. That is to say, as desegregation is taking place under international pressure, you have these African and Caribbean diplomats coming to Washington looking for embassies. And oftentimes they're looking for embassies, residences in these elite neighborhoods, which is driving the settlers crazy. They don't want Black neighbors, even if they're from Mali or Algeria, for example. And so this leads to, it helps to contribute to this anti-Washington ethos, because the State Department stands on the side of the foreigners because they're trying to win favors from the Malians and the Algerians, for example. And then revolting in terms of, I start the book by talking about 1918, when the Negroes are on the march. They're armed, shooting at soldiers. For example, this is during the midst of, as World War I is lurching to a close. There are pitched battles on the streets. Then in 1968, the same thing. After Martin Luther King is assassinated on April 4th, 1968, you have these explosions again, pitched battles in the streets. And I also talk about the the strategic significance of Washington. In the introduction, I talk about how you have these U.S. war planners en route to the White House to plot war strategy against Vietnam. But demonstrations stop them from getting to the White House, which slows down their bombing campaign. So one of the lessons that even the dullest reader should take away from this book is that if you're really serious about transformation of U.S. imperialism, you have to pay attention to Washington, D.C. You have to pay attention to the capital. Just like if you're serious about transformation in France, you have to pay attention to Paris. Mm-hmm. You're serious about transformation of Britain, you have to pay attention to London. Should be intuitively obvious, but once again, somehow that basic fundamental lesson has escaped too many of us.
Oh, so this is one of your books that's about to come out, and then you have already another book in the works. So, I mean, I'm thinking at the University of Houston, they must be pretty busy updating your webpage on a weekly or monthly basis, because sometimes with academics, you can do it maybe once every few years. They work on something, and then that stands, I guess, in your case. That would be an issue.
How these academics, it's dangerous. I mean, so far, so good. I mean, knock on wood, as they say. I mean, I haven't been liquidated yet, but you always run that risk in this country because this country, they've mastered the concept of the lone crazed gunman. That's how they get rid of presidents, for example, a lone crazed gunman. That's how they get rid of political opponents. I used to live in Zimbabwe, and let me preface these remarks to say that I'm in solidarity with Zimbabwe in its struggle against sanctions for having the audacity to seize the land of the settlers. But having said that, in Zimbabwe, they would get rid of political opponents. They would have car accidents. That was a place where always car accidents. People would, leaders would die in car accidents. So
very I guess bad driving. Country,
what'd you say?
Very bad driving. It had nothing to do with politics. It was just bad driving.
Bad driving, yeah. I say, damn. Maybe they need a chauffeur. Or...
So I guess each country has its way.
Exactly, based on your culture. The cultural
we have to let you go soon, but we would love to talk about cinema and arts one time as well. We found out that you have writings about cinema and arts, but we wanted to focus on this book this time, but we wanted to ask you for future if you have time. Love to talk about arts and cinema.
Yeah, I love talking about cinema and arts. That's how I occupy a lot of my time.
Oh, that's anything good you've seen recently? Just before you go.
Well, let's see now. Anything? It's I see it like 2, 3, 4 movies a week, so it gets sort of jumpy. But I can tell you my current project. I can tell you about my current project.
Yeah, sure.
And this is something I recommend to others as well. I try to fill in gaps in my knowledge by watching documentaries. So lately, I've been watching documentaries about innovations with regard to attack helicopters, armed personnel carriers, mortars, artillery shells, because as we know, political disputes are oftentimes resolved militarily, for better or for worse. And so if you're trying to understand how these political disputes are going to be resolved, you would be advantaged if you understood the battlefield. And it also stems from my project Armed Struggle, because the brothers and sisters who I'm writing about, they embarked on armed struggle. They really didn't do any sort of analysis of military science. They didn't even do an analysis of the correlation of forces domestically or globally. They just decided that the ruling class was bankrupt. They needed to be overthrown, which I understand, but I mean, shouldn't you have some sort of analysis of how are you going to, if you're going to launch armed struggle against this imperialist power? I mean, do you have a rear base, for example? They thought they had a rear base in Cuba, but these folks, they were typical U.S. They would get in disputes with the Cubans. So they got
You
ousted.
need a strategy.
Right, exactly. And so I've begun studying. That's what I've been doing lately. Is
Military documents, trees, basically.
yeah, looking at military documents, wars, guerrilla war,
Oh.
etc.
That's very
And
interesting that you say that, because I feel like, and I'll include myself in this, a lot of time when people make social and political commentary, we kind of really push the military stuff aside and not even, talk about simple things such as perhaps the strategic importance of Crimea as a place. I mean, I don't know these things either, but I completely understand your point and the importance of this. Or Sam often talks about high grounds or low grounds, thing like this, when you look at different kind of conflicts. So, I mean, yes, we often,
High
I
ground
feel
is
like,
good.
neglect these things completely and act like they have absolutely no importance whatsoever.
now, I could put you in touch with some people who are in jail right now. Have been in jail for I should say prison, been in prison for decades because of a failure to understand some of these basic points. That is to say, having a strategic plan based upon an analysis of international forces, domestic forces, and then after that, if you decide to launch armed struggle, well, then knowing something about military science. And by the way, for those in your audience who are interested in studying military science, I would send them back to Engels, Marxist comrade, who wrote quite a bit on military science, and of course, his work is still used in classes in many socialist countries.
Very interesting, Professor. No idea about that either. Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope you can get to your next interview and next appointment on time. And thank you, folks, for watching.
Sorry for keeping you.
Yes. Please like
It's
and
all
subscribe.
good. Hey, be sure to send me the link.
100%, definitely. Thank you again, Professor, and have a good day.
Hey, good luck to you.
Thank
you.
Thank you. We'll contact you soon, hopefully, about the future interviews.
Right on. Right on. Good luck.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good day.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye.